Throwaway account. I'm 31M. My girlfriend is 29F. Together almost 3 years. From the start, I was proud of being the easy one. I didn't complain much. I didn't need constant reassurance. I didn't ask for long talks after every disagreement. I told myself that made me mature, stable, a good partner. She liked to say that about me too. You're so chill. I love that you're not needy. I wore those words like a badge of honor. Compared to her past relationships, full of drama, jealousy, emotional swings, I was calm, predictable, safe. Whenever something bothered me, I downplayed it. If she canceled plans last minute, I said it was fine. If she forgot something important to me, I shrugged it off. If I felt ignored, I told myself I was being dramatic. I didn't want to be that guy, the one who made everything heavy. The first red flag came disguised as praise. One night, after I brushed off something that genuinely hurt, she smiled and said, "This is why you're so easy to be with." Easy. At the time, I thought that was love. I didn't realize yet that I was slowly teaching her something dangerous, that my needs were optional. And once someone learns that lesson, they rarely forget it. Once I accepted the role of being low maintenance, everything quietly rearranged itself around that assumption. If plans changed, I adapted. If she was stressed, I made space. If I needed something, I told myself I could handle it alone. It felt noble at first, like I was being strong for both of us. The twist was how quickly easy became expected. She stopped checking in when she canceled. She'd text, "Running late, we'll do it another time." And I'd reply, "No worries." Even when there were worries, when she vented about her day, I listened fully. When I tried to talk about mine, she'd nod, then redirect. I didn't push. I didn't want to take up too much space. I told myself this was balance. But one night, I caught myself editing a message before sending it, removing anything that might sound like a need. I stared at the screen, realized I was minimizing myself in real time, and felt a flicker of unease. I hit send anyway. "Oh, good," I wrote. It wasn't true. She started assuming I'd be fine with things she never would have been fine with herself. Less time together. Fewer check-ins. More emotional distance. And every time I absorbed it quietly, it reinforced the same idea. He doesn't need much. The moment that stuck with me came when she forgot my birthday plans entirely. When I laughed it off, she said, "See? This is why you're different." Different, yes, but also slowly disappearing. I didn't know it yet, but being low maintenance had stopped being a trait. It had become a permission slip to overlook me. The realization didn't hit me during a fight or a big moment. It came during something small, which somehow made it worse. She was planning a weekend trip with friends and talking to the details out loud, dates, places, who was going. I listened, half smiling, waiting for my role in the story to appear. It never did. At one point, I asked casually, "Oh, am I coming?" She looked genuinely surprised. Not annoyed, not defensive, just surprised, like the thought hadn't crossed her mind. "I figured you wouldn't mind," she said. "You're pretty flexible." Flexible. Another compliment that landed wrong. I said it was fine. Of course I did. I even meant it in the moment, but after she left the room, the quiet felt heavier than usual. I realized something unsettling. She hadn't excluded me out of malice. She hadn't excluded me at all. I simply wasn't part of the calculation. The twist was how familiar that felt. How often decisions were being made around me instead of with me. Plans, priorities, emotional bandwidth. They were all organized in a way that assumed I'd adjust quietly at the edges. That night, I thought about how often I'd said, "It's okay," when it wasn't. How many times I'd chosen peace over honesty. I told myself I was being understanding. What I was really doing was teaching her that my presence was optional. I didn't feel angry. I felt replaceable. And that's a hard thing to admit about a relationship you've been calling healthy. Because once you realize you're not being considered, the question isn't why. It's how long you've been helping it happen. After that weekend trip conversation, something in me shifted. Not loudly, not all at once. Just enough that I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. I didn't want to accuse her of being careless or selfish. I still wasn't sure she was. So I decided to do what I'd been avoiding. Say what I needed out loud. I waited for a calm moment. No tension. No argument. I told her I'd been feeling a little taken for granted lately. That sometimes it felt like decisions were being made without me in mind. I said it carefully, like I was handling something fragile. Because I was. She listened, then smiled in that reassuring way she had. I just didn't think you minded, she said. You're so independent. I love that about you. It wasn't dismissive. It was almost affectionate. And somehow, that made it harder to respond. The twist came when she added, if you want something, you should just say it. I can't read your mind. The words sounded fair, reasonable, but they ignored the part where I'd been saying it, just quietly, politely, in ways that didn't inconvenience her. By the end of the conversation, I felt oddly embarrassed, like I'd asked for something I hadn't earned. I backtracked, told her it wasn't a big deal, that I was probably just tired. Later that night, lying next to her, I realized I learned a dangerous lesson. If I asked for more, I became a problem to solve. If I asked for nothing, I stayed easy to love. And I could feel myself choosing silence again, not because it felt right, but because it felt safer. After that conversation, I didn't stop needing things. I just stopped voicing them. It felt like a compromise at first, one I told myself was mature. If asking for more made things awkward, then maybe peace was about wanting less. So I adjusted my expectations downward and called it growth. The twist was how quickly silence became transactional. When I didn't bring things up, she seemed happier, lighter, more affectionate. She'd say things like, I love how easy things are with us, and I'd feel a quiet ache behind the smile, because I knew what easy meant now. It meant I wasn't rocking the boat. It meant I was absorbing the discomfort. So she didn't have to. I started catching myself mid-thought, deciding whether something was worth mentioning. Most of the time, I decided it wasn't. A canceled plan, a forgotten promise, a moment where I felt invisible. None of it felt big enough to justify risking the calm. And slowly, that calm began to feel fragile, like it only existed as long as I stayed quiet. One night, she asked why I'd been so relaxed lately. I almost laughed. Relax wasn't the word. I was contained. Managed. I told her I was just tired. She kissed me and said she appreciated how low drama I was. That was the moment it clicked. Peace wasn't free. It was being paid for what parts of me I kept setting aside. And the more I paid, the more normal it felt. I didn't realize yet how expensive that bargain would become. But I was starting to understand something important. Silence can look like harmony from the outside and feel like erosion from the inside. It happened in the middle of a normal day, which is why it caught me off guard. We were talking about something trivial, what to do for dinner, I think, and she suggested a place I didn't really like. I opened my mouth to say so, then stopped, not because I was unsure, but because I already knew the outcome. If I objected, I'd be adding friction. If I agreed, things would stay smooth. So I agreed. The twist was how automatic it felt. I didn't weigh my preference at all. I skipped straight to compliance. And right after, I felt this dull, hollow sensation in my chest that I couldn't explain away. I started noticing how often that happened. How many opinions I filtered out before they ever reached my mouth. How often I chose the path of least resistance, without even considering what I wanted. It wasn't that she shut me down. I shut myself down preemptively. One night, I was scrolling through old photos on my phone and came across pictures from the first year we were together. I looked different. Not happier exactly, but fuller, louder, more present. I realized I hadn't laughed like that in a long time. That's when the thought hit me, sharp and unsettling. When did I decide my inner life was negotiable? I wasn't compromising anymore. I was shrinking. And the scariest part was that no one had asked me to do it explicitly. I'd volunteered, slowly, politely, in the name of being easy to love. I went to bed that night understanding something I hadn't wanted to face. You don't vanish all at once in a relationship like this. You fade, until one day you notice there's barely anything left to give. The feeling didn't arrive with panic. It arrived quietly, like a realization that had been waiting for me to catch up. She was telling me about a new coworker, how funny he was, how easy it was to talk to him, how time flew by when they worked together. I listened, nodded, smiled. None of it sounded inappropriate. That wasn't the problem. The problem was how optional I suddenly felt by comparison. She was animated in a way I hadn't seen in a while. Engaged, curious. When I asked a follow-up question, she answered briefly and moved on. It hit me then that she wasn't sharing with me. She was sharing near me. I was a safe place to deposit words, not a person she was actively connecting to. The twist came later that night. She mentioned she might stay late the next few evenings. "You'll be fine, right?" she asked casually, already assuming the answer. I said yes before she finished the sentence. The moment passed, but something stayed with me. I realized she didn't need reassurance from me anymore. She didn't check how I felt. She didn't wonder if I'd miss her. My flexibility had become an expectation, and expectations don't get thanked. Lying in bed, I imagined what would happen if I stopped being easy, if I said no, if I took up space again. The thought didn't feel empowering. It felt risky, and that scared me more than anything else, because it meant the relationship only worked as long as I stayed small. And once you see that clearly, you can't pretend you're equal anymore. I didn't plan to test anything. I just reached a point where staying quiet felt heavier than speaking up. A few days after that conversation about her staying late, she asked what I wanted to do that weekend. Normally, I would have said, "Whatever you want." This time, I told her clearly that I want to spend time together. Not errands, not side-by-side scrolling. Actual time. She paused. That pause was a twist. It wasn't long, but it was enough to tell me this wasn't a simple request to her. She said, "I already made plans with friends, but we can maybe do something later?" The word maybe sat there between us. I said okay. Again. But this time, I felt the disappointment instead of swallowing a whole. Later that night, I told her hurt that spending time together felt like an afterthought. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I just said how it landed for me. She sighed and said, "I feel like you're making this into a bigger thing than it needs to be." The sentence was familiar. The effect was the same. I realized then that taking up space wasn't welcomed. It was tolerated. As long as my needs stayed small, things stayed smooth. The moment they grew, even slightly, they became inconvenient. That night, I lay awake thinking about how often I confused being loved with being accommodated, how I'd accepted crumbs because I didn't want to seem difficult. And for the first time, I asked myself a question I've been avoiding. If being myself makes this harder, what exactly am I protecting by staying? After that weekend conversation, something inside me stopped trying to smooth things over. I didn't become cold or distant. I just stopped translating disappointment into excuses for her. When plans changed, I noticed how quickly I was expected to adjust. When she was tired, I made space. When I was tired, I managed it quietly. The imbalance wasn't dramatic. It was consistent. The twist came when I imagined what would happen if I disappeared for a while. Not emotionally, just practically. If I stopped initiating, stopped checking in, stopped being available on demand. The answer scared me because it felt obvious. Things would continue mostly the same, maybe even easier. That thought lingered. One evening, she forgot we were supposed to meet for dinner. Completely forgot. When I reminded her, she apologized quickly and said, "I figured you'd understand." And I did understand, but not in the way she meant. I understood that my understanding had become a safety net she didn't have to think about anymore. I didn't get angry. I didn't argue. I just felt this deep, quiet sadness settle in. Not because she forgot, but because I realized she hadn't checked whether forgetting would hurt me. That's when it finally clicked. Being easy to love doesn't mean you're deeply loved. Sometimes it just means you're convenient, low friction, uncomplicated to overlook. That night, lying in bed, I stopped asking myself how to be better for the relationship. I started asking a different question, one that felt heavier, but more honest. If love requires me to keep disappearing, what am I actually being loved for? Once that thought took root, It didn't leave me alone. What am I being loved for? Not who I was, but what function I served. The calm one, the understanding one, the one who didn't complicate things. I started noticing how often she described me to others in those terms. He's just easy. He's super chill. Never he challenges me. Never he knows me. The twist came when I imagined saying no. Not dramatically. Not angrily. Just no. No to changing plans last minute. No to always being flexible. No to minimizing myself to keep the mood light. The idea made my chest tighten. Not because it felt wrong, but because I didn't know how she'd respond to a version of me that took up space consistently. One night, she asked if I want to come with her to something I genuinely didn't enjoy. For the first time in a long while, I said no without adding an apology or an explanation. She looked surprised, then slightly annoyed. "Okay," she said. "I just thought you'd be easy about it." That sentence landed harder than any fight we'd ever had. Easy. I realized then that my agreeableness wasn't a personality trait in her eyes. It was a guarantee, something she'd come to rely on without ever questioning the cost to me. And the moment that guarantee cracked, even slightly, something shifted. That night, I didn't feel proud or empowered. I felt clear, because I finally understood what I'd been avoiding. The version of me she loved was a version that asked for nothing. And if that was a requirement, then the problem wasn't that I'd changed. It was that I was finally becoming visible again. After that moment, I didn't rush to fix anything. That was new for me. Normally, if something fell out between us, I'd smooth it over, make a joke, apologize, reassure her that everything was fine. This time, I let the discomfort sit where it was. I didn't escalate it, but I didn't erase it either. The twist was how quickly she noticed. She asked if I was upset. I said no. Then she asked if something was wrong. I told her I was just thinking. That answer seemed to bother her more than anger would have. She wasn't used to me being quiet in that way. Present, but not accommodating. Over the next few days, I noticed how often she checked my reactions. When she changed plans, she waited to see if I'd push back. When she talked about her schedule, she paused, like she was gauging whether I'd simply adapt or say something. It was subtle, but it was there. And that's when I realized something important. My silence before had been convenient. This silence was unsettling. I wasn't withdrawing to punish her. I was just no longer cushioning every moment for her comfort. And without that cushion, the imbalance became visible in a way it never had before. One night, she said, half joking, "You've changed." I didn't deny it. I just said, "I think I stopped pretending." The room went quiet after that, not tense, just honest. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't afraid of where the conversation might lead. Because whatever happened next, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't willing to disappear again, to keep the peace. The conversation happened a few days later, almost by accident. We were cooking dinner together, something we used to do a lot more when things felt easier. She commented that I seemed distant lately, not accusingly, observationally. In the past, that would have been my cue to reassure her, to explain myself away. This time, I didn't. I told her the truth, that I'd been thinking about how often I made myself smaller to keep things smooth, how being easy had slowly turned into being overlooked. I said it calmly, without blaming her, but I didn't soften it either. That was a twist. She didn't get defensive right away. She looked confused, then uncomfortable. She said she never asked me to do that if I wanted something, I should have spoken up sooner. I told her I had, just not loudly, and that every time I did, I learned it was easier to stay quiet. There was a long pause. Then she said, "I just don't want a relationship that feels heavy." Something about that sentence made everything click. She wasn't wrong for wanting ease, but she wanted ease without responsibility. She wanted closeness without accommodation, a relationship where her needs were expressed freely and mine stayed manageable. I asked her what happened if my needs weren't easy. She didn't answer right away, and in that silence, I realized I already knew the answer, because for the first time, I wasn't trying to translate myself into something more convenient. I was standing still and seeing whether she would meet me there. Her silence lingered longer than I expected. Not dramatic, not charged, just empty. When she finally spoke, she said, "I don't think relationships are supposed to feel this complicated." The word complicated landed the same way heavy had earlier, like a label meant to end the discussion, not deepen it. That was the twist. I realized heavy didn't mean conflict. It didn't mean hardship. It meant me having needs that required adjustment. It meant moments where she'd have to slow down, consider someone else, change course. In other words, it meant partnership. I told her that wanting to be considered didn't feel complicated to me. It felt basic. She frowned, like she was trying to understand a language she never needed to learn. She said she loved how low pressure we were before, how easy everything felt. Before I spoke up, I thought back to all the times I'd swallowed disappointment to keep things light, all the emotional labor I'd done quietly so she wouldn't feel burdened. That was the low pressure she missed, not closeness, but convenience. That night, we went to bed without resolving anything, but something had resolved itself in me. I no longer felt confused. I wasn't trying to figure out how to explain myself better. I finally understood the mismatch. She wanted a relationship that flowed around her life. I wanted a relationship that included mine. And once you see that difference clearly, you stop trying to convince someone that your needs aren't too much. You start asking a different question. What would it feel like to be with someone who doesn't experience your presence as weight? After that conversation, I stopped trying to return to the version of myself she seemed to miss. The easy one, the one who absorbed disappointment quietly and called it maturity. I realized that version of me wasn't healthier. It was just quieter. And I didn't want to live like that anymore. The twist was how clearly I could see her discomfort now. She wasn't angry. She wasn't cruel. She just didn't know what to do with a partner who took up space consistently. When I expressed preferences, she looked surprised. When I didn't immediately adapt, she seemed unsettled. It was like the relationship had been built around an unspoken rule, and I'd quietly stepped outside it. We talked again, briefly. She said she felt like things had changed too much, that she missed how natural it used to feel. I understood what she meant. It was natural for her. For me, it had required constant self-editing. That was the moment I finally let go of the hope that I could explain this in a way that would make her want something different. She wasn't failing to understand me. She just didn't want a relationship that asked her to meet someone halfway emotionally. And I wasn't angry about that anymore. I felt something closer to acceptance, because staying would have meant choosing a version of myself I no longer recognized. Leaving meant choosing uncertainty, but also honesty. For the first time, I wasn't trying to fix the relationship. I was listening to what it had been telling me all along. And once you do that, the next step becomes surprisingly clear. The decision didn't arrive as a dramatic moment. There was no final argument, no ultimatum. It came quietly, like a truth that had finished explaining itself. One evening, we sat on opposite ends of the couch, the TV on but unwatched, and I realized I felt calmer imagining life without this relationship than I did imagining another year inside it. That was the final twist. I told her I didn't think we wanted the same kind of partnership anymore. I said it gently, without blame. I told her I needed a relationship where my needs didn't feel like an inconvenience, where being myself didn't add weight to the room. She listened, nodded, and said she understood. And in that moment, I knew this was the right call. There was sadness, but no shock. No fight, just confirmation. Packing my things felt surreal, not because it was hard, but because of how much lighter my chest felt with every box. The first night alone, I noticed something small but profound. I didn't rehearse my thoughts before having them. I didn't downplay how I felt. I didn't edit myself for peace. Here's what I learned. Being low maintenance can make you easy to stay with, but it doesn't guarantee you're truly seen. Love isn't about being convenient. It's about being considered. If you're reading this and you've been shrinking yourself to keep someone comfortable, hear this clearly. You're not asking for too much. You're asking the wrong person. Leaving didn't mean I failed at love. It meant I finally chose to be visible.